Welcome to The Explainer. Right now, we're watching a massive geopolitical shift completely rewire the global map right before our eyes. And honestly, it's happening a lot faster than anyone predicted. We're going to unpack some incredibly complex moving parts today, tracing lines from Washington to the Middle East, all the way over to the Pacific. We'll break down exactly what's going on, why these new alliances are forming at breakneck speed, and what this shifting security landscape actually means for future conflicts. Let's get right into it. So here's the big question on everyone's mind. Is the Middle East actually building its own version of NATO? And why exactly is the US suddenly pivoting its military focus all the way over to Asia? To make sense of these rapid-fire regional pacts, like the newly dubbed Mecca Pact, we've got to zoom out first. The world is reacting to a very specific catalyst. And to grasp the full picture, we have to understand what the United States is currently doing on the global chessboard. Section 1. The U.S. pivot to Asia and the resulting power vacuum. To really grasp this power vacuum, we have to look at how Washington is completely reassessing its priorities. They're slowly, but very clearly, stepping back from the security guarantees they've provided to the Gulf for decades. And as you can imagine, that is making traditional allies incredibly nervous. Just look at a recent speech in Manila by U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Elbridge Colby. He stated, "America is not disengaging from Asia. We will ensure a favorable balance of power environment." The indirect message there, it's loud and clear. The U.S. is explicitly deprioritizing the Middle East because their absolute top priority and their main perceived threat right now is China. They're shifting their diplomatic and military capital away from the Gulf to focus entirely on the Pacific. So how exactly does the U.S. plan to handle this Pacific pivot? Well, it all comes down to a military concept Colby highlighted called deterrence by denial. Now, the old American playbook was mostly retaliatory, right? If an ally got hit, the U.S. would strike back. But deterrence by denial completely flips the script. It's about building a fortress so incredibly strong, a barrier so literally impenetrable, that potential enemies are completely denied access right from the start. They can't even get to their target. It's a massive, massive shift in how they posture their military. Geographically speaking, this fortress is what's known as the first island chain. Picture a physical ring of islands. It starts up north in Japan, sweeps down through Taiwan, and anchors in the Philippines, which is actually America's oldest ally in Asia. The U.S. is pouring resources into heavily reinforcing this specific chain to bottle up any potential Chinese military movement into the wider Pacific. But with the U.S. laser-focused on building this specific wall, what on earth happens to the Middle East? That brings us to Section 2. Decoding the Mecca Pact and the birth of a new alliance. With that American security umbrella rapidly folding up, the Middle East is waking up to the reality that the era of relying on Washington, it's pretty much over. And in direct response to that vulnerability, we're seeing something huge, the formation of a brand new, highly significant defense pact between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. People are calling it the Mecca Pact, and it's drawing some heavy comparisons to NATO for a very good reason. The core principle is exactly the same. An attack on one is considered an attack on all. But there's a catch. While NATO leans on its famous Article 5, Pakistan's foreign minister was extremely careful to root the Mecca Pact in Article 51 of the UN Charter, which guarantees the right to individual or collective self-defense. That's a highly calculated legal framing. They want to make sure this is seen as a purely defensive, totally justified agreement, not an aggressive one. And emphasizing that defensive nature is absolutely critical here. This pact basically formalizes military cooperation that's already happening behind the scenes. For example, a squadron of Pakistani troops has actually been stationed in Saudi Arabia since 2025. Plus, Saudi Arabia has been showing immense restraint in the current regional conflicts, which sends a clear signal. This pact is about preventing wars, not starting them. And honestly, this might just be the tip of the iceberg. Sources are already indicating that countries like Egypt, Kuwait, Jordan, and Qatar are potential future members looking to get under this expanding security umbrella. Section 3. Iran's divided response and the internal divisions it's causing. Now, when a massive Sunni majority military alliance forms right on your doorstep, you'd probably expect a swift, unified reaction from Iran, right? Well, actually, no. The analysis reveals a really fascinating split inside the Iranian political establishment. On one hand, the Iranian Foreign Ministry actually sees the Mecca Pact in a somewhat positive light. They're calling it a sign of changing perceptions. To them, it's proof that the U.S. is just a fading false broker and that regional states are finally realizing they have to secure themselves. But then, on the flip side, you have the hardliners, the folks closely aligned with the IRGC, and they are completely dismissive. They argue that Iran, through its established network of proxies, is still the true, undisputed leader of the Islamic world and the axis of resistance across places like Palestine, Lebanon, and Yemen. The main argument for these hardliners, which has been voiced by figures like Professor Morandi, is pretty blunt. They point out that historically, Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia haven't exactly stepped in to protect areas like Gaza or Lebanon. So, from the hardliner perspective, this new Mecca Pact has absolutely nothing to do with genuine Islamic solidarity. They see it as a panicked, knee-jerk reaction driven by pure self-preservation, specifically to protect Saudi Arabia now that the American shield is disappearing. Moving to Section 4, the Muslim-NATO question and some vital historical parallels. You've probably heard the term Muslim-NATO thrown around lately. It's the big buzzword dominating geopolitical analysis right now. But is it actually an accurate label? Well, to figure that out, we have to look back at the exact circumstances that gave birth to the original NATO. Think back to 1945. World War II just ended, Europe is totally exhausted, their armies are depleted, and suddenly this massive Soviet threat emerges. Fast forward to 1949, and 12 exhausted nations signed the NATO treaty in Washington, D.C. But here is the kicker. In 1949, NATO was literally just a paper promise. There was no shared military structure at all. It wasn't until 1950, when the Korean War kicked off, that they faced a real, undeniable catalyst. That shock was what finally forced NATO to evolve from a piece of paper into an actual joint military command with shared equipment and headquarters. Which brings us to a really fascinating question. Is the Mecca Pact currently sitting at its own 1949 stage? Right now, just like early NATO, it's essentially a formal treaty on paper, a mutual promise of defense. The history here suggests that, sure, it might lack a fully integrated joint command today, but it might only take one major real-world regional crisis, a catalyst exactly like the Korean War was for NATO, for the Mecca Pact to rapidly evolve into a highly active, fully integrated military force. And finally, Section 5, the new global chessboard and the emerging alliances. Let's zoom out for a second. We've seen the U.S. pivot to Asia, and we've watched the Mecca Pact form in response, but geopolitics, it's a game of action and reaction. This massive reorganization is forcing other major players to formalize their own counter-alliances. Take India and Israel, for example. Almost immediately after the Mecca Pact was announced, we saw active diplomatic signaling from an emerging India-Israel bloc. By publicly reinforcing their ties through diplomatic calls at this very specific moment, they're signaling a hardened axis back to Washington. They're basically saying, hey, if new blocs are forming, don't forget that our aligned bloc exists right here. It just proves that the entire region is rapidly ditching the old, unwritten rules and formalizing brand new security structures. Ultimately, what we're witnessing here is the total dissolution of those old alliances that completely relied on the U.S. security umbrella. As America steps back, analysts are suggesting that their remaining regional military bases, the ones currently scattered across places like Bahrain or Jordan, they might eventually consolidate heavily into Israel, hiding behind the advanced protection of the Iron Dome. This massive vacuum is basically forcing regional powers to formally put their defense agreements on paper. The era of standalone defense is officially over. Nations are realizing they just can't survive alone anymore. So I want to leave you with this final thought. We are literally watching the birth of a multipolar world, where the Middle East is fundamentally rewiring its own survival architecture. As these massive new blocs solidify, the US and the Pacific, the Mecca Pact in the Islamic world, the India-Israel axis, where are these shifting tectonic plates going to collide next? Where is the next major geopolitical fault line going to emerge? It's a fascinating, rapidly changing landscape, and for sure, one we're going to keep watching closely. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.